All right, g'day again. Welcome to Go Fantasy. It's the Monday Rage Trade edition. Go Fantasy brought to you by checkmyrate.au. Visit the website. It's free to use. Take control of your financial future. Brandon and the team will get you a better home loan rate. So, new Monday podcast. It's the Rage Trade edition. So, I feel like we wake up after lockout and all we want to do is tinker with our team and look at all the different options that we've got in front of us. And it's a guilty pleasure of mine. You know, previously it was probably going to the gym and in between lifting very light weights. So I'd be mucking around my team, maybe listening to a fantasy podcast that came out on Sunday night, something like that. That had become part of my Monday routine, perhaps a little different these days with Little Max, but I feel like it's something that as soon as lockout lifts, we want to be able to see what are our options, what's on the table. And I think it's a really good idea to come together as a fantasy community and talk about all these trade options that we have. So at the moment, it'll be focusing on players that we want to target, not necessarily trade outs, but making a little list for AFL Fantasy and for Supercoach of players just to discuss and talk through. And of course, the Errol Goulden news means that we're trading out a premium midfielder, which the majority of the competition has. So that gives us, a lot of decisions to make, and it's worth talking through what's on the table in front of us. So to kick things off in terms of trade targets, and it is a little bit different this week because essentially we're probably thinking about rookies that we've missed, or trying to do fix-up trades, as they're traditionally called, to get us back on track after our start to the season. So the two names that have sort of jumped into my mind who aren't really highly owned players are Milan Murdoch and Braden Cook. So Murdoch came onto the scene only a couple of weeks ago at West Coast, and I think understandably there might have been some reticence to pick him given that he'd only been at the footy club for a few weeks, but it was a really good performance for West Coast against Gold Coast in a game that you probably wouldn't necessarily expect him to post a high score. He got 95, he kicked a couple of goals, which obviously pumped the score up a little bit, but the role looked pretty good. So he's already gone up 62k in AFL Fantasy, so he sits at 292. In Supercoach, he's still 99,000, of course, and not on the bubble, so he's not a must-have this week, but I think a player who is a mature age at a club that is rebuilding, who seems to have been given a pretty decent role, is someone who we're looking at. And certainly in Supercoach, you have the luxury of waiting another week. So Elijah Hewitt and Tim Kelly both weren't in the side, and it remains to be seen how that affects Murdoch. But such a good first-up performance makes me think there's certainly going to be some job security there. And then Braden Cook, we just weren't sure what the role was going to be at Adelaide, and he's a little bit more expensive. I slotted him in at F5, essentially thinking, well, if it's a failed pick, at least I can cover him during the bye rounds with best 18. But he looked pretty good first up, being given a chance on the wing, and you'd think, ideally sliding to half back, that would be the best result for our teams. But 84 for the Crows against the Pies, and looks like he's pretty safe in that team. So they'd be 1 and 2 on my list in terms of fix-up trades in AFL Fantasy. Cook, I think, is a very natural move from Filippo if you want to ditch him after the low score and the quad injury. And then in AFL Fantasy, the other things I'm looking at here are rooks that we must have. I think it's worth just checking off everyone, just in case you've missed someone, because there might be someone who got squeezed out because you went a less popular rookie who didn't quite nail it over the weekend. So Milan Murdoch is currently nearly 20% in AFL Fantasy. He's down at 6% in Supercoach, but as I said, not as much urgency to get him into the side. For Cook, his ownership is currently 7% in AFL Fantasy, costing you 386. But if you haven't gone for a bunch of those mid prices in your forward line, then Cook is certainly an option. The rookies that we must have, who are going to have really high percentage of ownership, obviously Jagger Smith, owned by 76%. Lockie McAndrew, I think, has shown he played really well against Darcy Cameron, that he is going to be an impactful player this season, so he's owned by 64%. Then Lockie Jakes has surprised us all with his scoring. Fantastic 112. If you had that on field, congratulations to you. One of my best mates had him and Grill both on field, and I think he's about 130th. and doing really well. So Jakes and Grill are both must-haves. Ownership's both in the 60% for them. Devon Robertson, great performance for West Coast. So his ownership's really high as a cheap forward. He's already up 69 grand. Blamires, I beg your pardon, decent role, scored well late for North Melbourne. I think he's worth having in your team as sort of your M9 or M10. And then Jai Sarong has been promising at Sydney to start the season. Certainly, I think his spot in the team is pretty safe. Leo Lombard managed to knock out a 60 against the Eagles. I don't think he's necessarily going to be a player that you field, but during the buys can pop into your side when required. And then it wasn't a great start for Josh Lindsay. He scored a few points late, but ultimately I think he showed against Gold Coast that he's not a must-pick. I think he's probably still a must-have in your squad, but I don't think he's a walk-up start, in your 6 defenders. He'll obviously pop in and out during the buys. But I think Jakes and Grill have shown themselves to be a little bit more fieldable than Josh Lindsay. He was lucky to get 66 last night. Let's see how he goes in a home game against North Melbourne coming up. So they're the rookies that you need to have. I think Murdoch and Cook are 2 to look at this week. And then, what are we doing with the Goulden trade? So a lot of talk about a downgrade to Murdoch this week. Or you could even go Cook if you wanted to, who's a mid-forward. And you're cashing yourself up for a move to Dacos when he comes off his bye, and you just have to pick someone to upgrade. That, on paper, makes a lot of sense. I think in terms of premiums who showed up and showed out, who don't have buys, I think Merritt and Sarong were the 2. And then Luke Jackson was incredible, but I don't know if you need to move heaven and earth to get him into your side unless you didn't start English. I think you bring Jackson in potentially now without that buy. Rochelle was the best of the mid-price forwards, but Rankin's coming back this week for Adelaide, so perhaps it might be better to hold one more week before you commit to Rochelle and see what that role looks like with Isaac back in the team. The real ballsy move here, chasing points, and perhaps it's not necessarily advisable, is to go Marcus Bontempelli off Goulden. So he's got the same buy, so you're not losing anything in terms of your buy structure, but you're gaining a premium immediately and you get points on field. And the Dogs and the Bontempelli made a really promising start to the season. It's an away game against Adelaide on Friday night, so it's going to require some cojones to back in the Bont. Maybe you wait, you're waiting that week to bring in Dacos off the back of the bye. It would be gutsy, but I'm just putting it out there as an option. So from a Supercoach perspective, in terms of players that are on the bubble of note this week, just wanted to knock a couple of those off for you. So if you miss Buderick or Jakes, the Bulldogs are off, they're playing their 3rd game of the season coming up on Friday against the Crows. So you need to make a move to get them into your team. Gothard as a bench forward for the Giants, and then Jai Sarong for Sydney. Their bye is coming up soon, but he will play his 3rd game on Thursday night. Leo Lombard for Gold Coast, and if you miss Christian Petrarca, who's made a superb start in Supercoach, you need to get him into your team because he's averaging about 160. He's been superb. And then Flanders at St Kilda, who hasn't absolutely shot the lights out, but he's a pretty reasonable price if you're interested in having him and you want to avoid the price rise, then now's the time to get Sam Flanders into your team. And of course, don't feel like I even need to say it, but you've got to get Jagger Smith in at some point. He's on the bye, but you need Smith in your team if you haven't got him yet in Supercoach. The other one is Joe Fonte. So he started really well for GWS. They've got a game against the Saints, who give up a lot to defenders on Saturday, and he has been a bit of a surprise packet. He's in my dynasty team, so I'm a bit of a Joe Fonte guy, and the role looks good early in the season. And to be honest, it even seems like he's taking points off Whitfield. So whether that continues long term, that remains to be seen. But in terms of plays you need to jump on immediately, that's a fairly comprehensive list. And then the Goulden trade is interesting this week. So I've got Filippo in Supercoach, and I think I'm going to move him to Cook. I only went Cook in fantasy. I didn't go him in Supercoach. And I was pretty confident about Marshall and Filippo on field at really reasonable prices, and Dev Rob as F7. So Marshall's injury doesn't look to be too serious, so I think you can kind of just stash him on the bench and wait for him to come back and ride that cash rise once he's fit and firing, and you've got enough cover with Lombard and Dev Rob. And I think, Filippo has been a little disappointing with his scoring, so I'm happy to pivot to Cook there and use a trade on that. And then the Goulden move is the one in Supercoach where we have to spend a bit of time working out what our priorities are here. Do you want to bank some cash, or do you want to just pivot immediately to another premium who you're hoping to keep for the whole season? So massive score from Caleb Sarong, who I think across all formats we thought was a little underpriced. Doesn't have a bye, which is tempting, and you get that nice score built in after a good performance from him against Geelong. So Caleb Sarong is one to consider in Supercoach. Zach Merritt, massive score for Essendon. Is he a man with a point to prove? Does he have the chip on his shoulder this season? I mean, the Bombers were just diabolical after quarter time, and that might persuade you to not invest in Essendon as a team, and that's probably the way that I would lean. And then again, the big gutsy move in Supercoach is to go Marcus Bontempelli from Errol Goulden if you can afford it. So I've actually had a look at that in my team. So Bontempelli in Supercoach priced at $706,800. He started the season with a 160 and an average of 136.5, the most expensive player in the game. Do you just take this opportunity to get him in? Sure, you weren't planning on this. Goulden injury is extremely unfortunate. I went into the season with a little bit of cash in my bank, which allows me the luxury of bringing in Bontempelli. Do you just make the move now? His break-even's 127 at the moment. So, yeah, interesting times. So trade targets this week, I'm looking at Sarong, I'm looking at Rochelle as an option, Bontempelli, although I'm advising probably to wait a week on Rochelle. The key is to get all the rookies, the must-haves, but Murdoch and Cook look good. Sarong as a premium, Bontempelli as the wild card option if you've got the cojones to do it across the formats. And they are your Monday rage trades. As much as I would like to ditch Darcy Parish out of my side, I think he survives another week. He deserves another look, particularly in fantasy where he didn't score particularly well. So I hope this has helped clear your mind and clarify things for you after the first weekend of fantasy. Keep your eyes peeled to socials for more, and we'll be back with mailbag and more news from around the fantasy world very soon on Go Fantasy.